Hey everyone. I am clearly indoors now because frankly it's too cold. Um, what I want to do is chapter 22. I bet you're super excited. I'm going to move ourselves here into a share screen. And this is going to be almost like a special populations go through here. Oh, I need these things to move away so I can move into the slideshow. So we need to look at training specifically for the female, children, masters athletes, and some special populations. So when we get into this and we're talking about women's training, we're really looking at vigorous training. We know that females and males are going to respond fairly similarly. What we might see is some changes in the ability to regulate heat during different phases of the menstrual cycle. So we're going to have some concern based on the menstrual cycle, some concern regarding eating disorders, bone mineral density, and specifically pregnancy. So when we talk about this, and I am absolutely sure this is something you've covered in other classes, we can have something called an athletic amenorrhea. So they can stop menstruating depending on how active they are. It really is going to boil down to the amount of training, psychological stress, and how much body fat they have going into it. You're going to see this happen in 12 to 70% of female athletes versus 3% in the general population. So clearly, there's going to be a risk here that needs to be looked at. What happens is we're going to see a modification of the hormone release, and it's going to result in this stopping of that menstruation. If we look at actually having a period training, there's really no reason to limit anything. You may have pain associated with menstruation, and that may be a limiter to training, but training during menstruation is not necessarily going to be a no-go, okay? So when we start looking at this amenorrhea, we're looking at a really big spike in the percentage of incidences once we hit 40 plus miles a week. All right. So if you see that climb, you went from a 20% probability at a 40-mile week training cycle. You bump that to a 65-mile week, and you're going to see that incidence almost double up to 40%. So it's a concern, especially in that distance running population. We're going to see eating disorders affect both male and female athletes, and again, you're nutrition majors, you've covered anorexia and bulimia, so I'm not going to beat those, but this is definitely something you're going to see in that athletic population. These are the warning signs, which again, you already know, that rapid weight loss, mood swings, excessive exercise. We hear people talk about an exercise anorexia, that they just work out forever. We know, again, the warning signs for bulimia. Like I said, we cover them more in depth if we weren't already nutrition majors. The thing I want to point out is I've treated runners for a long time. And we look at this triad as being an eating disorder. I would clarify and say we may see something with disordered eating. Instead of diagnosing it as an actual eating disorder, let's look at it from a purely mathematical sense. You take in X amount of calories and your activity supports X amount of need for calories. And if we run into a negative deficit, we have disordered eating because we are not eating what we need to supply the energy for the tasks we're asking our body to do. So I would give a little grace when I'm looking at an athlete. Is it a an actual eating disorder, or are we not nutritionally taking in what we need to support our activity? Ran into a couple of athletes in the past where really not anorexic, not bulimic, we just simply did not consume enough calories for the training level that we were doing. So we can look at that as a big bump in mileage, going from a high school athlete to a college athlete, or going from that average college athlete to the next level college athlete. She graduated years ago, but Brene was Mansfield's first and only at this point All-American. Well, no, not All-American. She was the D2. She won the 10,000, was runner up in the 5, or vice versa. Either way, amazing, amazing athlete. If you looked at her, you would consider her to be anorexic. Bottom line is the kid didn't like cafeteria food. That's what it boiled down to. So she got an apartment on her own, really didn't like to handle meat, just didn't like to touch it cold. Kid would eat whatever you put in front of her as long as you fed her. So it wasn't so much I would consider it to be an eating disorder. She just didn't eat well if left alone, simply because she didn't want to touch it. So her last year, the year that she won championships, we kind of just adopted her. I think she ate dinner at my house 4 nights a week, and we usually just packed her leftovers to go. I never, ever gave that kid something she didn't want to eat. She would just eat whatever was put in front of her. As long as she didn't have to do it, life was great. So in that instance, you could look at it as we had an eating disorder going in, but it was simply a matter of she did not consume what she needed to expend. And that negative deficit showed up as weight loss. Once we fixed the problem and somebody else made her food, life was great. So, I mean, the kid will walk in my back door, you know, she's 21 college student. And she's like, you know, your 4th kid is here. Can I set the table? It was absolutely fine. But just keep in mind, there's going to be some things at play. So if you are doing stuff with athletes, the easiest assumption is we have an eating disorder. I'd point out that sometimes circumstances are part of it. So make sure we're asking all the right questions so we get the right answers. So, all right, moving off my little soapbox. Osteoporosis, we're going to see a loss in bone mineral content. So we can see that based on this estrogen deficiency because we're not menstruating, or we're just not taking in the calcium that we should, maybe because of an eating disorder. Exercise, we talked about weight-bearing activity helps stimulate bone growth, but exercise cannot completely reverse this bone loss that's occurring because of the mineral content. So when we look at this, we call this a female athlete triad, where we see this low energy availability with or without disordered eating, menstrual dysfunction, and low bone mineral density. What happens with this? You know, we can see that we're going to have negative consequences. You know, these are going to be the kids that stress fracture. They're going to be more prone to injuries. So, you know, a lot of it indicates that it's low energy intake. So there's low energy availability, which is going to lead to these health problems and disrupt cellular homeostasis. So again, you know, is it an eating disorder or just disordered eating? So here we'll see that low energy availability and its effects. You can see one of them, you can see all 3 of them, but they usually kind of run together. So moving on from that female athlete, let's talk about the pregnant one. Most women can safely perform low to moderate intensity exercise during an uncomplicated pregnancy. Let's look at that uncomplicated pregnancy. Why can they actively maintain training? You know, what puts them in a position? If they are able to monitor body temperature and keep that body temperature increase to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's going to help. You're going to see pregnant women do super well in an aquatic environment. That water is going to maintain body temperature, which is huge. We have to make sure that they're maintaining adequate hydration. They're going to have to drink every 15 minutes, and they're going to have to really monitor fluid balance by body weight, like make sure we're not losing that hydration. And we may need to reduce training intensity and volume as the pregnancy advances. So the doctor is going to say, we're good to go. We're not good to go. So again, low to moderate, we should be good. We've already talked about in Kines that we see female athletes are at a higher risk for certain knee injuries, almost 3.5 times more likely to risk a non-contact ACL. That's quite a lot. So what are they looking at? Probably the biggest thing is going to be the knee anatomy. Okay. But we might see at different points in the menstrual cycle that we have more joint laxity. So are they in a position to be more detrimental? We might see imbalanced strength, proprioception, landing biomechanics, again, related to that knee anatomy. And like we talked about, those fluctuating hormones during the cycle may compromise some of that true ACL strength. So again, the amenorrhea is going to be worse in distance runners. May also see it in ballet dancers as compared to others. You're going to look at dancers as being a group subset that probably has a lot of disordered eating. So keep that in mind. The other thing is the psychological stress involved in what they train and how they go through. That may also have a part in it. Again, exercising well, menstruating shouldn't be a big deal unless it's super painful. The rest of these are all things that you know. All right, so sports conditioning for kids. So we know that their VO2 max improvements are very similar to adults. So there's no real risk involved based on training. When we look at some musculoskeletal stuff, training may optimize growth in kids. We may have concerns regarding growth plate closures and just damage to those articular surfaces and those muscle tendon insertions. We don't want to do anything that let's look at me. I'm not tall. I didn't get tall. I don't think exercise was why my growth plates didn't close, but you really want to look at not beating up some of these kids so much that weight-bearing impact does prematurely close a growth plate. I mean, as somebody who didn't break 5'1", like every inch matters. So keep that in mind. What's the best way to prevent injuries in a kid population? Watch their form and technique. We can do a lot of things to promote muscular strength and bone density. And I think those are all things we should do because as a general, kids are not as active as they should be now. But, it's quality versus quantity. We need to make sure that they're moving well. The other thing to look at is some kids are just a disaster. Their limbs have gotten longer, their muscles haven't caught up. They are just kind of a hot mess of figuring out where they are. Form is going to be super important on those kids, moving well, not just moving often. Just as a pictorial to remind us where that growth plate is, we just don't want to see those close before they should. Let's look at cardiac death in young athletes. The risk is very, very low, 1 in 3 per 100,000. It's not the exercise itself that's the problem. There is a congenital heart defect and it hasn't shown up until in an exercise situation. They might be things that you know about and they might not be things you know about. So the medical screening can help reduce some of the risk, but the biggest things we're looking at, it was a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's just too big. Congenital abnormalities, especially in those coronary arteries, aneurysms, and congenital stenosis of those aortic valves. So we can be stiff, we can be too big, we can be swollen, we can have weak walls in the case of an aneurysm. Those are all things that may just be there. Again, we have found over time, we see AEDs at most venues that are going to be athletic related for kids, because they are the group that will typically respond best to an AED. But again, when we look at that risk, it doesn't outweigh the benefit of doing the exercise. So something to look at. The other thing we want to look at here is resistance training. Again, we can improve both bone density and muscular strength. Just have to watch out for those growth plates and look at a little too much weight-bearing activity. All right, let's look at some populations now that we're off of females and kids. Let's go to some type 1 diabetics. Yes, type 1s can train vigorously. They just have to be free of complications. They can obtain the same benefits as non-diabetics. You need to avoid hypoglycemia. So again, we have to look at the exercise diet and how do we maintain that optimal blood glucose control. They may need to have snacks, carbs, and drinks available, something to look at. The other thing is their insulin injection site should be away from working muscles. That way we're not seeing an increase in the rate of uptake and that hypoglycemic response. Okay, but yes, they can absolutely do it. Asthmatics, everything is great except for scuba. All right. We want to make sure that their bronchospasm is controlled. We should have an inhaler nearby. And we recognize that the scuba, it's the pressure. It's the pressure of the water around. That's the problem. So if we had an asthma attack while diving, we can create serious damage. It might be okay for everybody with a normal airway at rest and don't seem to exhibit exercise-induced bronchospasm. But, you know, if my kid's an asthmatic, you know, scuba is not going to be the thing that goes on their list, maybe ever. So just kind of keep that in mind. Epilepsy is seizures, right? So we can have a transient loss of consciousness, muscle tremor, right out to a grand mal seizure, okay? Does exercise induce a seizure? Maybe. There's some mixed opinions on that. Stress can be a cause of seizures. So if physically we're stressed, maybe. So we might see the risk of seizures increase during exercise and during recovery. Biggest things are going to be a blow to the head or injury caused during a seizure. So I think it's case by case, you know, depending on what kind of seizures you have, you may react pretty similarly each time. Let's come up with a couple scenarios where seizures during the activity could be detrimental. One, swimming. Just because of the safety concern, you don't want to see them drown. But that environment overall would actually be a pretty soft landing, right? We just don't want to sink. So if it's well lifeguarded and everybody's aware that they're an epileptic and really being watched, maybe swimming would be a fantastic sport for them. But those are things to look at, you know, where are we at? Where can we fall to? You know, some people have a lot of seizure activity. Some people have one seizure every 9 months. So it really just kind of depends on what we're dealing with. Age-related muscle strength changes. It's one of my favorite slides because it means our life sucks, okay? Scarpopenia is our age-related loss of muscle mass. Okay, so I tell my patients all the time that after the age of 40, we lose 1% of muscle mass every year because we turn into beef jerky. We kind of dry out, shrink up, and our body just kind of eats itself. All right, so why does it happen? We're going to see a decrease in the muscle size and the number of fibers. So I tell everyone they better start lifting in their 40s so they have something to lose by the time they reach their 50s. Exercise can help reduce, retard, slow down this loss. So we're going to see resistance training as being helpful. Anything is better than nothing, but it may not completely erase the deficits. So if you look at this, you know, awesome. I'm at 45 years old, so I'm wrapping right up to that. But can you see how that muscle mass just falls off? And men and women, women are going to lose even more strength cumulatively because we had a lower bar on average than did men. So it's really something to look at as to where we end up. So you can see, trained started higher. So yes, we're going to steadily go down, but the curve is not quite as steep. And because we started with more, we had more to lose. All right. So active, you're going to fall, and you can see that sedentary really fall off pretty quickly and significantly as far as capabilities. You start at 100% and then you drop down to maybe 70. Or you start at 60% and you're down to 40. Those are big losses overall. When we look at endurance performance, we're going to see a decline after age of 60. It's going to take longer to run a 10,000 meter race. Okay. We're going to see about a 1% decrease in VO2 max after the age of 40. Again, training can slow it down, but it can't prevent it completely. Why? Part of it is we'll see a decrease in max cardiac output and that AVO2 difference. So we're going to see just an overall decrease in that VO2 max. Our lactate threshold doesn't really change. Our economy of running doesn't necessarily change. If you had crap form to start with, your form will remain crap. If you had okay form, you're probably going to remain okay. I'm not a runner. I mean, it's obvious. I'm not a runner. I'm married to a runner and I have children who are runners. That being said, my husband turns 50 next week, actually, and he can still kick his kid's ass all over the place in running. Training wise, he's still better. And if it came down to push comes to shove, he's still going to win. I don't know. Check back in 2 years. May really not still be the answer, but it is today. And part of that is his economy with running, his form through running. Remains really great. He's, almost a foot taller, which doesn't hurt anything. But I would expect over the next 5 years, they will continue to increase in their peak and he will continue to fall off. So just keep that in mind. We'll see at 60, see that sharp spike upward and how long it takes to complete runs. But you can see a steady drift, 30 to 40 to 50. But after 50, that was a misspeak. After 60, you're going to see a sharp rise. So again, same thing, see it fall off pretty steadily. Again, if you started with a higher VO2 max, your decline might be steeper, but your net is still better, okay? So again, when we look at trained versus sedentary, it's still going to fall, but maintaining that arc above makes a big difference. So when we look at it, aging, decrease in maximal heart rate, decrease in max stroke volume. We're going to see that max AVO2 difference decrease, which is all going to come together for that VO2 max letdown and to eventually see the endurance exercise performance decrease. Okay, so as we get older, muscle mass and strength go away. You're going to see that really at age 50. Exercise resistance training can help. And we'll also see our endurance start to fall off. Again, 60 is going to be our big spike in those. When we look at masters athletes, we want to know that they're medically cleared. Training principles are going to be similar. We just have to look at overtraining symptoms in these individuals. Every training program needs to be individualized. We need to avoid overuse injuries. There needs to be rest days between challenging workouts. But we want to see them continue to compete. I will put up in separate links both of those YouTube videos, but things to look at. All right. Yay. There's 3 more chapters. At this point, we should be working on our exercise prescription pretty steadily. Make sure if you're having any questions or issues with it that you're reaching out. so that way we can get them answered. All right, 23 will be next.